I would like to introduce you first to a friend of mine. You may be familiar with this gentleman. His name is Larry Cernik. He was born and raised in Colorado. Is that before it got weird or after? He moved. Larry is married with 5 kids. He is a 30-year veteran of the culture wars. He is a builder, cabinet maker, amateur gunsmith, firearms safety and skills instructor, a hobby farmer, sometimes freelance writer, and advocate for limited representative government and life, liberty, and private property. And on a personal note, he and his family are my personal Jedi Master marksmanship instructors. So please give a warm welcome to Larry Cernik.
You notice that Jeff and I are not the same height. Well, I'm here today to talk about history because it's very important that you understand your place in history. And to understand that, you need to know something about what has transpired in the past. So I'm going to take you back 238 years to April 19th, 1775. The place that we're going to be observing here is the Lexington Green in Massachusetts. And we have at 5 a.m. in the morning a clash of 2 societies represented by 2 men. One of these representatives is Lieutenant Jess Adair with 250 redcoat soldiers. He's a defender of autocratic government. On the opposite end of the green, we have John Parker with 77 local militiamen. Parker is 46. He's been diagnosed with tuberculosis. He's been elected captain of his local militia, which is a show of the respect they had for his character and his leadership abilities. John Parker is a defender of representative government. Well, how did they get here? Well, the answer to that is it wasn't overnight. There was a trail of transgressions and oppressions. We would categorize these as violations of rights. One of the issues was taxation. Both the manner and the amount, I'm sure, were of importance, but particularly they were upset because they had no representation in the taxation that was being laid upon them. They were now living in a controlled economy. The British Parliament had laid a whole bunch of regulations on them and set it up in a system of what we call mercantilism. That is, they were sort of like a captive group of producers as well as a captive group of consumers. They could only buy and sell to and from the people that are authorized by the British government. Parliament was arbitrarily infringing against the charters and the covenants under which the colonies had been founded. Each colony had a charter, and they were allowed to have local representative government in their colonies, self-government at the local level. The king was doing so also. The king was very aggravated with this group of people across the Atlantic that seemed to be vying for independence. Already there'd been the disbanding of the colonial courts, which is very significant. Many of the colonists believed that they had been left in a state of anarchy because the king had disbanded the legal system. And he'd replaced it with a system of martial courts operating under a completely different law system. The colonial legislatures had also been disbanded. Their method of self-governance and self-representation had been disbanded by the Parliament and by the king. The governors that they had elected had been removed and replaced by appointed loyalists, people that didn't represent them at all. The fishing industries up and down the eastern seacoast had been shut down by force, and Boston Harbor had been closed, had been put under blockade. Boston itself had been placed under garrison once before, and now by April 19th, they'd been placed under garrison another time, an occupation of British troops, quartered in the city, many of them in people's homes without their permission. They had gone so far as to begin a policy and a procedure for confiscation of martial supplies. In those days, it was gunpowder, cannon, firearms, and anything else that they felt could be used to support resistance to the crown. Essentially, this is an 18th century version of gun control and confiscation. I'd like to briefly depart from this for a moment to mention that just today I saw an article on the web about a proposal by Frank Lautenberg in the United States Senate to require background checks for gunpowder. Sometimes things don't really change that much, do they? Well, on the one side in Boston, we had a set of people on the British side, on the Loyalist side, General Thomas Gage, who was the replacement for the governor. He was sent there by orders from the king. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, one of his subordinates, who was to lead the expedition that Gage was planning. Another man, Major John Pitcairn, soldier of sorts, was the next in command. And then, of course, I already introduced you to Lieutenant Jess Adair, an Irish guy who was another Marine of sorts, but kind of a rash man, it's reported. One thing these guys all had in common is they had a rather low opinion of the colonists. We know this by the things that they wrote about them, and they were not exactly flattering. Basically, they regarded them as beasts of burden, not fit for anything except to carry something for a real man. And there were other worse derogatory things said. The king had demanded that something be done about this resistance that they were finding in the colonies, and Gage came up with a regimen of what he called powder raids, or what began to be called powder raids. The idea was to confiscate munitions from the colonists so that they would be left without a way to resist and protect themselves. So, on the other side, in Boston, were a group of men, many men actually, but these are people of note among them. Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a pious man whose father, who had been killed in a farm accident earlier, his mother was able to scrimp and save and put him through medical college. After he developed his practice, he himself funded his brother's education in the same thing. Widely known for his great charity among the people. People at that time couldn't often keep up with their bills, and he was a very generous man. Paul Revere, who you've probably heard about, a silversmith in town, but much more than a silversmith and much more than just a rider on a horse. Revere and Warren together had developed a whole system of communications which was to prove to be invaluable on April 19th, 1775. John Adams, well known for his commitment to the rule of law. There was also Sam Adams, who was nicknamed the Last Puritan. You'll have to read his biography to understand exactly why that's the case. But Sam Adams was an organizer and responsible for many of the public demonstrations and gatherings in Boston at the time. Also John Hancock. John Hancock had an interest in a shipping operation, and it was widely reported that he was a smuggler. Anticipating that things would worsen, they diligently prepared and organized for that eventuality. They developed methods of self-defense by organizing militia, and they developed methods of force multiplication by means of communication and the alarm system that they set up. I need to mention here also someone not in Boston, and that's Pastor Jonas Clark in Lexington, who had been one of the prominent organizers of the Lexington militia. This sounds very strange to our ears today to find a clergyman involved in such activities, but it was not unusual up and down the eastern seaboard at that time. There were many more people that we don't know all their names, but basically the heart of the matter is the people that were resisting the British were people just like you and me. They weren't terribly different from us. They were occupied with their various occupations, but they realized that they were living under a system that could not be sustained, especially in relationship to their own personal liberties. There was a substantial intelligence gathering on both sides. In other words, each side knew what the other was doing. There were spies on both sides, intelligence and counterintelligence operations, and Gage became very frustrated with this. He made comments to the effect that Any order he issued in the morning would be heard down in the tavern by noon. So he became obsessed with secrecy, not letting anyone know what his plans were. The colonists, on the other hand, were organized in a decentralized manner. In other words, there was no kingpin in the organizational chart. They were very diffuse, and as a result, if they were compromised in one area, they could make up for it in the other. A very good method of organizing that they had. The rest of the people, like I say, were people. There were many more people that were active in Boston and in the colonies at this time. So it was really quite a massive operation. So things began to happen on the evening of April 18th. There was activity in the harbor. Longboats were being prepared, and the information that Warren and Revere were getting was that they were about to make a move. And indeed they were. General Gage had decided to make his move, and that move was to send an expedition on a powder raid to Concord. Sam Adams and John Hancock were at Lexington staying with the Reverend Clark, and this was also well known. And as a matter of fact, there were outstanding warrants for their arrest, and had they been apprehended, they would have been sent over to England for trial, and likely a short rope from a tall tree. So Gage's plan was to ferry his men across Boston Bay to Cambridge, the area around Cambridge across the bay, and he was putting his plan into effect. Revere and William Dawes and Joseph Warren concluded that it was time to send the alarm out. They had information, reliable information, that they were headed to Lexington and Concord. So they set out. Dawes was set out on horse across the Boston Neck, a strip of land that connected the city at that time to the main body of land. And Revere was to be rowed across the bay with a couple of people. An interesting matter is that Revere barely escaped detection twice. Once when he was being rowed across the bay, and the other time when he was on the road headed for Lexington and encountered a redcoat patrol. He was able to escape from that and circumvent them. Revere had also come up with a plan of redundancy to put lanterns in the bell of the North Church in Boston. It could be seen from Charleston, and they had an agreed upon code for that, one if by land, two if by sea. And Revere implemented that with an accomplice before he was rowed across the bay. By about midnight, Revere arrives at Pastor Jonas Clark's house and begins to awaken them. But on his way there, he had raised the alarm with every small burg along the way, and with any farmhouse where he could raise someone to be awake. And these people, in turn, were extending the alarm beyond their boundaries into the northern and southern settlements in the area. So the word started to pass very quickly. By midnight, the word was already traveling north and south in the region. So the alarms then were set up from Lexington and spread far and wide. John Parker and his militia were called out, and they met at the tavern. They deliberated, like most of the men of the time did, as to what they should do, and it was decided that they ought to send scouts out to determine if the redcoats were in fact coming. There had been some false starts before, and they wanted to be sure that this wasn't another one. Revere and Dawes, after having obtained some refreshment, headed out to warn Concord, and fortunately, along the way, they met a fellow by the name of Samuel Prescott, a doctor who happened to be a resident of Concord. And this was an amazingly fortunate event because a short distance down the road, they encountered another one of the British patrols. Dawes took his horse, ran across the field on it, and jumped a fence there, and was unfortunately unhorsed. He wasn't, however, captured. Samuel Prescott, being much more familiar with the territory than Dawes was, chose another route, jumped a fence, and ended up in Concord a short time after. Unfortunately, they apprehended Paul Revere for a brief interrogation and decided to let him go on foot, and he headed back for Lexington. Fortunately, like I said, Prescott made it to Concord, and so that they were prepared for events that would follow later in the day. So by 5 a.m. on April 19th, 1775, we find Lieutenant Jess Adair bringing in his troops into Lexington. Adair wasn't actually familiar with the totality of their mission, and seeing militia gathering on the green under John Parker made him wonder whether it was prudent to march on past Lexington or to leave his flank exposed. He decided that the better part of wisdom was to enter the town and confront the militia. Parker sees them coming and tells his men to hold their fire unless they are fired upon, but to stand their ground. They weren't going to run. As this begins to occur, there develops a sort of uneasy pause in the action as they took up their positions, and the regulars began to chant, "Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!" expressing that they were anxious for a fight. Major John Pitcairn shows up on the scene, dismayed that his troops have detoured into Lexington. He rides across the green, pistol drawn, cursing the colonists and demanding that they lay down their weapons and disperse. Captain Parker reassesses the situation and decides to order his men to disperse, but to keep possession of their weapons, and they begin to disperse. At this time, a shot rings out. No one knows for sure where it came from, and many more follow immediately from the British line. This volley deals death and injury to the dispersing militia. A few of the militiamen decide to stand and fight and are shot and bayoneted. Jonathan Harrington, a young man with a young family, is shot in the back while dispersing and manages to crawl to the porch of his house, where he dies in full view of his young family. For a while, chaos prevails, and the British officers were unable to curtail it. The troops apparently were not under orders, not under control of orders, and the system that they were following was one that had been used in other parts of the British Empire of warrantless searches and confiscations. Essentially, it was sort of a legalized form of plunder. Colonel Francis Smith finally shows up, and he's appalled at what he sees. Smith is more of a gentleman than this, and he orders the reorganization of the ranks. He's ready to get them formed up and moved out of there. However, to gratify his men, he allows them to fire a victory volley and to cheer themselves with 3 huzzahs, leaving behind them a scene of carnage, death, and disruption. There are 8 dead colonists laying on the green, and there's 10 wounded. This was to be a long, long day for the British. They would meet with more organized resistance in Concord, which would send the British regulars reeling in retreat and confusion under nearly constant fire from the colonial militias. They were fortunate enough to return to Boston by dark without being either annihilated or captured. The alarm devised by Warren and Revere had been wildly successful, turning out approximately 14,000 armed militia in less than 24 hours by the end of the day. The war had begun and would last a long 8 years until independence. How did they make it? Well, I think you ought to look to the character of the whole society to make an assessment. They were a hardy, self-reliant people, well-versed by their pastors and clergy on the moral principles of self-government, limited government, and a love for God and the God-given and therefore inalienable rights expressed in a biblically defined form of justice. We would summarize these as life, liberty, private property, and representative government. Well, what about us? We're on the timeline in history now. How do we stack up? It's a question I think we need to all ask ourselves and answer honestly to ourselves. Do we love liberty as they did? Or have we also succumbed to the spiritual malaise, the sickness of the soul, which is pervasive in our contemporary society? I'd like to ask you, think about this. Does the fire of liberty still burn? And if so, where does it burn? Right here. Amen. Thank you very much.
So now you know why we chose the 19th for this particular event. It was not a coincidence. This history is not taught in our schools a lot today, and for that matter, I'm not going to shame any of you today, but maybe you don't know it. If you don't know it, and if you enjoy it, I want to strongly urge you to check out a program that's called Project Appleseed. Larry was the Idaho State Director for about 18 months, and he may be coming to that point again at some point, but they hold them at the Lapway Range down in Lewiston, and they have had them at the Linville Road Range here in Moscow. You can find them online at appleseedinfo.org. It is a 2-day course of marksmanship instruction and heritage. So I would strongly urge you to do that. They have discounted rates for both women and kids. So if you have never done that before, here's a great opportunity to do that.